Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, now with its very own unique, bespoke theme music, for which we're extremely grateful to composer and dear friend Jules Chisek. In fact, Jules is such a dear friend, I couldn't resist pulling his leg a bit with my initial response to him sending me the music he composed and saying, yeah, it's really, really good, but I think we're going to stick with Robinson Crusoe for now. Whereas, of course, in fact, we're not. So this is our music from here on in. We may still use Robinson Crusoe for the outro if we don't have anything appropriate. So a big thanks to Robert Mellin, who composed The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. It's seen us through the first 16 episodes. But now we have a wonderfully quirky and individual little piece of music, in my opinion, which kind of conjured up an image of the sort of movie that music might accompany in my mind, and I'd be very curious to see what sort of images it conjures up in our dear listeners' minds. So please do drop us a line at hosts@historybyhollywood.com. That's hosts@historybyhollywood.com, or you can get us on Twitter @historybyhwood, and let us know your thoughts. Thanks very much. And now, back to the original intro.
Hello and welcome to History by Hollywood, a podcast series that examines the real events and people behind fact-based movies. This is episode 17 for Sunday the 24th of September 2017, and today we're turning the spotlight on 2015's Selma, covering the civil rights marches in Selma, Alabama that took place in 1965 under the leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King. My name is Andrew Blischik, and with me, as ever, is Martin Darlington. Hi, Martin.
Hi everybody, hello Andrew. Just to let you know, looking forward in the next episode, as we have mentioned, we'll be covering our second visit to a Ron Howard film, Apollo 13, and also our second visit to leading man Tom Hanks, who plays Jim Lovell. So that shall roll out on Sunday the 8th of October. 2 weeks after that, we're going to be looking at a film that kind of ties in with today's episode. And this is the 1989 movie Glory, covering the achievements of the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, which was the US Army's first African-American regiment, except for the officers who were all white.
Of course.
That stars Denzel Washington, who got an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, Morgan Freeman and Matthew Broderick. Was directed by Edward Zick, and if you haven't seen this film, we really urge you, track it down, watch it. It didn't win 3 Oscars for nothing.
Great. We still don't have enough reviews to allow iTunes to give us an average rating. If you do use iTunes to listen to us, please take the time to fire us the amount of stars you feel appropriate and just write a few lines. It really does help other people find us. And whatever platform you use to listen, please do spread the word to anyone you think might enjoy the show, whether they're a history buff or a film buff or just someone interested in learning stuff. Thank you.
Indeed. And now, on with the show.
One day, when the glory comes, it will be ours, it will be ours. Oh, one day, when the war is won, we will be sure, we will be sure. Oh, glory, glory, glory. Oh.
So the story of the movie. Selma is a 2014 Hollywood drama, actually released I think at the beginning of 2015, right. Wasn't it? Depicting the real life events around the 65 voting rights marches from Selma, Alabama to the state capital Montgomery, led by, amongst others, Martin Luther King, as we mentioned. The lead role is played by British actor, stage and film actor David Oyelowo in his first leading role in a major film. It was directed by Anna DuVernay, who'd previously seen some modest critical success with a couple of early movies, although originally Lee Daniels was set to direct, and Paul Webb, who wrote the screenplay, or the original screenplay, had been pushing Hollywood for years to make a film about Dr. Martin Luther King. So Lee Daniels cast all sorts of people that didn't appear in the final film. Hugh Jackman would have been in it as Sheriff Jim Clark, Liam Neeson as President Johnson, Robert De Niro as segregationist Governor George Wallace, etc. But the only survivor from his cast to Anna DuVernay's was David Oyelowo as Dr. King. And she did a huge rewrite, didn't she, on...
so she claims,
on the screenplay. But one of the things she had to do, I think kind of slightly sadly, Warner Brothers and DreamWorks with Steven Spielberg had bought the rights to Martin Luther King's speeches.
From the King family, yeah.
From the estate of, from the King family. For a biopic that they're planning for the future on MLK. And therefore Anna DuVernay had to rewrite his speeches to have the same meaning without using exactly the same words.
Yeah, quite an achievement, because she does pull it off, I think.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The movie was nominated for both Golden Globe and Academy Award Best Picture categories, and Anna DuVernay became the first African-American female director to achieve this. And whilst it didn't win either of them, it was nominated and won many other awards, including an Oscar for Best Song.
Selma was a critical hit, holds an impressive 99% favourable rating review on Rotten Tomatoes. It was also a financial success, took about $80 million at the box office and cost a modest $20 million to produce. Selma was filmed on site in Georgia and Alabama and runs for just over 2 hours.
Yeah, and at the Selma Walton Theatre in Selma, Alabama, when it opened, it was screened for free, which is a nice little touch.
And the modest $20 million production cost might have gone up a lot higher if some of those big-name actors had been attached to it, like Robert De Niro and Hugh Jackman. So.
Yeah, and surprising number of British actors in the
lead roles.
Including what to me as a British guy sounds quite convincing accents.
Yeah.
I think Tom Wilkinson as Lyndon B. Johnson, it slips a couple of times, but it becomes a bit London. But
Oyelowo does a great job, doesn't he, as King?
Yeah, and he's got the cadence of his speech and his movement and
his accent.
Yeah, very, very impressive. Okay, so
on with the show?
On with the show.
Okay, the opening scenes then of Selma. The movie opens in October '64, and we've had the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which is supposedly ends segregation in the South. We see at the start of the movie Dr. Martin Luther King, played by British actor, we say, David Oyelowo. He's receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, and just before he has to accept the award, he turns to his wife, Cora Scott King, played by another Brit, Carmen Eogo, that he hopes he can soon be a simple pastor once again, once his work is all done. So we've got a black man winning the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, and he says hopefully life can go back to normal. So, but this doesn't mean that his work is done between black and white Americans in the South. The very next scene, while he's still giving his acceptance speech, shows a black church in Alabama where a bomb suddenly explodes, which injured many people and kills 4 small girls aged between 11 and 14.
Yeah, the next scene we see Annie Lee Cooper, a black Southerner played by Oprah Winfrey, very well as well, seeking to register to vote in Alabama. The white official, the registrar interviewing her, makes her jump through several hoops to pass the registration process. He gets her to quote word perfectly one of the amendments to the Constitution, which she does. And he says, how many voting counties are there in Alabama? And she says, 67, sir. And he goes, name them. So you can see that, this is just bureaucracy conspiring to prevent black voters from registering to vote. She's denied voter registration in a scene that epitomises the Jim Crow anti-voter regulations designed to suppress black voter turnout. These laws would eventually be abolished before the Supreme Court. So I think maybe at that stage we do a scene-setting reality check.
For the times.
Yeah. Martin Luther King did really win the 1964 Nobel Peace Prize, and he collected it in Norway in that October.
But some 100 years earlier, in the 1760s, 1860s, thank you. The Confederate slave-owning states of the South had lost the Civil War. This meant an end to slavery in the US and the granting of freedom and voting rights to black Americans, or at that stage the male ones at least. Discrimination, as you all probably know, did not stop, and as we mentioned in our review of the movie Hidden Figures, all sorts of regulations existed in the next 100 years in the southern states to keep the two races segregated. This included a bunch of local laws and regulations designed to make it harder for blacks to register and vote in elections. We've already mentioned that collectively these are called the Jim Crow laws, even though that phrase isn't used in the movie. Jim Crow was a dim-witted fictional blackface stage character created around 1830 by a white actor, Tommy Daddy Rice. The term Jim Crow became a derogatory term whites used to refer to blacks in general. These Jim Crow laws were clearly aimed at suppressing black people from voting, but it wasn't limited just to blacks. In some states, the Indian population were expressly mentioned to jump through these hoops, and in California, they were targeted against the Chinese. It was very common for a literacy test to be a prerequisite to vote, as we saw the Oprah Winfrey's character having to recite the Constitution, so clearly she can read, and often there was a requirement to pay a poll tax, so that would be quite a disincentive for a poor black person to have to come up with a bit of cash to be eligible to vote. There was also a requirement for a successful candidate for voter registration to clear one final hurdle. They needed an already registered voter to vouch for them. And in an area with virtually no registered black voters, this prevented even the most prepared and persistent candidates from succeeding.
The Alabama church bombing and the 4 dead girls really did happen in Birmingham, Alabama, but it had been a year earlier and not actually after the Nobel ceremony, as the movie suggests. Annie Lee Cooper, played in the movie by Oprah Winfrey, had indeed been trying to register to vote for years, and after one attempt was sacked. Now, it was one thing that to register to vote, you had to put your name in the public roll to say you were registering, and then they were published along with your address.
Yep.
So you were an easy target for Ku Klux Klan and white segregationists to target you. And your employer, who would generally be a white business owner, would often sack a black worker who tried to register. And this happened to Annie Lee Cooper. Many fellow black workers at the retirement home where she worked walked out in support, but they were all sacked, and their details and photographs passed to other businesses to ensure they would remain unemployed. So there were economic tactics as well as violent tactics used against the black community.
Not mentioned in the film, Dallas County, where Selma sits, was effectively ruled by a Judge James Hare, a self-proclaimed expert on racial eugenics. He claimed that the local blacks were descended from the Igbo and Angolan slaves, who were genetically incapable of achieving an IQ higher than 65. The sheriff for Selma was Jim Clark, as portrayed in the movie, but his jurisdiction was over the county, not the town itself, except in the courthouse, where he did have jurisdiction again, but more of this later.
Yeah, the town came under the control of Police Chief Wilson Baker, who was a much more moderate and level-headed man than Jim Clark, who was a racist bigot. I don't think that's being pejorative, is it?
No, accurate.
I think that's a fairly objective assessment of him. He's mentioned in the cast list, but I can't remember Wilson Baker appearing much, but in reality, he actually had quite a lot to do. As for the activists, there were two main groups. There's Dr. King's SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who advocated strictly non-violent protest and also said that whilst we may ignore local laws, racist laws, we must obey federal laws because we need the federal organisations, government on our side. And then we had the SNCC, who were the Students' Non-Violent Coordination Committee, who, despite their title, were a lot more ready to embrace sort of direct action or more confrontational action.
Yeah, it comes out clearly in the movie.
Yeah.
Okay, so back to the film.
Yep, I think we should carry on with the film.
In the next scene, we see King meeting President Lyndon Johnson, played by British actor Tom Wilkinson.
Tom Wilkinson,
thank you. They're in the White House, I think, and Johnson's trying to co-opt King to work with him to improve the lives of black Americans in favour of the president dealing with more radical leaders like Malcolm X. So Johnson thinks that King is more reasonable and he can work with him, unlike the fiery Malcolm X. King demands some action on black people's right to vote against those Jim Crow rules. Johnson hedges his bets, and Dr. King is told that the voting thing will need to wait. Dr. King is not happy and tells Johnson that the whites will control everything forever while they are the only voters and the only members allowed to sit on juries, because of course jury duty is allocated to eligible citizens taken off the voter roll. They agree to disagree and part ways.
Yeah, next we see Martin King arrive in Selma, Alabama, where blacks are more than 50% of the population but are still very restricted from voting. The black contingent around King enter the Selma town hall, and King meets a white racist local who walks up, says, "Oh, are you Dr. King?" And he says, "Yes, I am," and he punches him in the face. So Selma's clearly a controversial powder keg of a place.
Yeah, look, we've had a little... That's a short return to the movie, but some important things have happened there, so maybe we could just do a reality check at that point. So we've had the President and Dr. Martin Luther King meet for the first time, according to the movie, that we see them in the movie. And there are several meetings in the film between King and President Johnson. And pretty much in each scene, Johnson is seen as fairly inflexible and unsympathetic to King's cause. And I guess, Martin, if there's one major historical mistake that the film kind of makes in order to advance the plot, I think it'll be the portrayal of the relationship between Johnson and King.
Yeah, there's one part where LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson says, look, you've got one issue, I've got 101. And I feel he's being a politician. You know, he understands he has to get people's opinion, the mass of the 200 plus million American citizens' opinion behind them.
And he's just had a big win in the previous year with the Civil Rights Act. Really a great thing to do. You know, his landmark legislation that he's gotten through, and he's just trying to say, can we just take it slowly? You know, can we just take it easy?
Yeah, at the same time,
which is logical and makes sense.
And at the same time, you can understand that for Martin Luther King, this is his. You know, okay, we've got a law against segregation, even though states were allowed to continue that on a local basis for a few years after that. But you know, the voting rights thing, he knows that's the only way you can get rid of racist police chiefs, mayors, governors, is to get people voting. So you can understand both of their perspectives.
But the consensus is that in most circumstances they had a amicable, working, a positive relationship.
Yeah, and I think they both had the same end in mind. Lyndon Johnson was maybe playing a bit more of a longer game, and of course as well at this particular period in history, he's just been elected. Part of his presidential campaign is no American troops will go to Vietnam other than the few advisors already there. And we know that was a great big whopping lie because they were already planning to up the troop numbers. And we'll come back to the Vietnam references later in the film.
Yeah, we've also seen the first shots in Selma, the eponymous town that the film's named after, and we've already learnt that, you know, the voting population for the blacks is minuscule, and Selma will remain the centre of the attention for the rest of the film. There's attempted marches and successful marches, and that drives the narrative of the rest of the movie. And all of those marches and the sequences that they're presented is quite historically accurate. Selma was the ideal choice to highlight black voting disadvantages. A majority black town of 10,000 voters, and like 60% of the population was black, and out of the 10,000 registered voters, only about 350 were black.
Yeah, the scene with the man punching Dr. King did happen, but actually later, after the first march, which we'll hear about, to the Selma courthouse, the perpetrator, a man called James George Robinson, who was a member of the, I find quite ironically named, National States' Rights Party, was arrested by Police Chief Wilson Baker. He was fined $100 and imprisoned for 60 days. So again, in reality, we see that, you know, not every white law enforcement officer was a racist bigot along the lines of Jim Clark.
Yeah. Okay, so back to the movie.
Yep.
Next we see actor Dylan Baker as FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover is dishing the dirt on King directly to President Johnson. To Hoover, King is a degenerate. Johnson describes him as a non-violent and manageable agitator, a more positive view than what Hoover has. Hoover suggests that they target King's wife based on some dirt he has on King and ruin King's life that way. There is no resolution either way, and the action moves to King's home in Atlanta. The King's Atlanta home is showing the strains of their high-profile and much-hated actions of King's protest movement. The Kings seem to resolve to battle on despite the stresses. King then calls a female confidant over the phone who sings him a midnight gospel recital to bolster his spirits. The next day, King and his entourage visit the home of another King supporter, Richie Jean Jackson. They take over Mrs. Jackson's house and settle in. Before they retire, it appears some more radical black student protesters are in town, and maybe there will be some violent protests in contrast to King's non-violent means.
Yeah, we went and see Dr. Martin Luther King. He's preaching from a pulpit, and he, as you say, he goes high. It's a very, very inspirational speech, and even though, as we mentioned earlier, it's not the actual words he used, you know, the message is strong, the message is powerful, and it's very, very well done. And David Aiello does a fantastic job. He's telling the crowd that for the greater good, he inspires the crowd for the greater good, despite the killing of the 4 children in the Alabama church. He says, 50% of Selma is Negro, 50% plus, only 2% can vote. That means we need to march, protest, and if necessary, go to jail. And he demands that the black community are given the vote. At a meeting with Dr. King and his team, 2 young activists from the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Cooperation Committee, demand action from King and not platitudes. King replies, "We can negotiate, demonstrate and resist, wait for the white man to overplay their hand." He says, "Eventually it worked in Albany. The impatient young community workers need to wait to raise white consciousness to the issue. The whites who live outside the southern states, especially the consciousness of the white president." King manages to mollify the younger hotheads and convinces them the strategic long-term non-violent path is the way to go. There's an interesting scene as well when he says he said to the sheriff here, "What's he like?" And they say, "Oh, he's a nut job." And he says, "Is he more Bull Connor or is he more Laurie Pritchett?" And now Laurie Pritchett we hear, actually we don't hear in the film, so I suppose I'm jumping into a bit of reality check here.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Laurie Pritchett was a sheriff, a bit along the lines of Wilson Baker in Albany, Georgia, and he'd been very moderate when people were blocking the road in a protest. He would arrest them, but him and his officers would peacefully and gently move them to jail and then process them and let them go, basically. And Martin Luther King said he completely defused the situation. We had to work really, really hard to actually get anywhere. Whereas Bull Connor, who was a famously brutal, savage, racist police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, had gone straight in with batons, and they got results much quicker when people saw the violence being perpetrated against non-violent black protesters. And I think this is the power of MLK's argument. If we resist, we can be portrayed as insurrectionists. We're not. We've got to remain non-violent.
And you understood the power of the media way back then. How images work. We mentioned just now about FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Shall we just?
Yeah, he's a certified Fruit Loop, isn't he? We know now.
Yeah, and blackmail people to get his ends.
Anyone who disagreed with his politics or he felt had different politics to him were eligible to be targeted. Normally labelled a communist.
Yeah.
Which is very much part of what he played against MLK. So do you want to do the FBI bit?
Yeah, so it's a fact that the FBI were keeping close watch on King and his supporters, together with, as Martin says, communists and anyone else that Hoover thought was a threat to America. And in fact, the FBI observation provides a nice little narrative device throughout the film. For many scenes where King and his supporters are meeting to plan their next move, the film lets us know where this is occurring by using subtitles in the style of an FBI report. So instead of the subtitle saying Selma on a date when they actually met, it shows like a typed dispatch. Instead of just saying Selma and some date, it says King arrives in Selma with Abernathy, Young and Orange and a female agitator, Diane Nash, 10:22 a.m. logged.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if FBI dispatches were like that, but straight away, in this particular scene, the FBI are clearly watching him and they're recording that fact. Because then the next scene, when they meet with the president, let's say, we don't get that kind of a little typed narrative plot device for us.
No.
So it's a nice little touch, I think.
The mention of Malcolm X as well is interesting. I think Martin Luther King understood that to get what they wanted, they needed to unite the entire country behind them, of all races, all backgrounds, to support, their desire to be treated like full-blown citizens. Yeah. Whereas Malcolm X was certainly in his early preaching, he wanted a black nation of Islam, effectively. He was a Muslim and he was pretty anti-white. Now, those views did become a bit more progressive maybe later on, but certainly Malcolm X advocated violent resistance.
Yeah, so the film suggests, and I think correctly, that there's two poles of the black protest movement: the non-violent King at one end, and the more violent, more aggressive Malcolm X at the other. And I think that's fairly true, historically accurate. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll revisit that later. It's also worth mentioning the 2 young SNCC activists, one of whom is John Lewis, who we'll come back to John Lewis, George Lewis,
John
Lewis, who we'll come back to later. But his the other activist, whose character name escapes me, did display some resentment, and there was some from local black activists who have been fighting for voting rights for years, or for a long time, and suffering with this sort of, oh, here comes the celebrity Martin Luther King.
Yeah, ignoring all the work we've done.
But MLK understood, and you can see it in the strategy meeting, the power of the media, and I think he understood, look, we're going to use this, because when I do turn up, I can get national TV to cover. And I think he was using his celebrity status, if you like, which I think that's probably a big reason he was happy to take the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
Because it gets media attention, and media attention, as we know, is how you can change things.
So we'll return to that tension between the people that want direct action and versus his non-violent. That comes up again, so let's park that for the moment.
Okie doke.
Back to the movie?
Back to the movie, and the first Selma March.
The first Selma March takes place. Blacks of all ages cross arms and march to the courthouse and the voter registration office. The march stops, and quietly and peacefully the demonstrators sit down. The sheriff threatens to disperse them.
And this is Jim Clark,
the
racist sheriff, whose only bit of jurisdiction within the town limit or the city limit is the courthouse, and that's where he is.
King says that they're here to register, it's their legal right to do so, and they will do it through the front door. 3 white police then brutally attack the peaceful protesters who were sitting down, you'll recall, yelling at them and getting in everyone's face. Oprah's character, Annie Lee Cooper, lashes out at one of them, and she's violently detained. The governor of Alabama, we see next, George Wallace, played by British actor Tim Roth. He's behind in front of Confederate flags, and he's defending the police action. While cutting back to the demonstration, King is arrested. We see the president watching all this on TV, and in the papers, to his disappointment, King is shown in prison, and it's clear he's getting tired of the fight, and he questions his non-violent approach with another black inmate.
Yeah, at the black church in Selma, whilst Dr. King is in prison, his wife meets with Malcolm X, the principal leader of the other extreme pole of the black movement. And at their church, Malcolm X tells her, look, my views of Dr. King has changed. I'm willing to help, although not necessarily in his non-violent ways. Mrs. King conveys this to King in prison, but he says, look, I'm not getting help from him. His methods are counterproductive. And in a weak moment, he says, it sounds to me like you're...
seduced? Oh, she's suggesting she was seduced. I forget the exact words.
Enamoured, thank you. There we go, voice from the back room. Thank you, Janine. Enamoured. He says, sounds like you're enamoured.
But as soon as he says it, his face drops, and he realises he's overplayed his hand and quickly apologises. Yeah,
and then meanwhile we cut to Governor George Wallace in his office, and he's exploding, saying, how on earth did Malcolm X this terrorist get into my state without me knowing about it? And then he says, look, I know Jim Clark, the sheriff, is a hothead, and he's a weak link. He could play right into the press's hands. So Wallace's advisor says, look, there's going to be a non-official night march the next night, which will not involve the press. And you get the idea that they go, we have a cunning plan.
And so the next night, we see some armed police rush the quiet protesters to teach them a lesson now that the cameras aren't necessarily rolling on them in this more private night march. Men, women and children are bashed and flee the police batons. Three of the fleeing demonstrators take refuge in a black cafe, but it's to no avail. A policeman simply walks in and starts to bash, beat and shoot these hiding marchers. And a young black demonstrator, Jimmy Lee Jackson, dies from a shot to the stomach. We see King going to see Jackson in the morgue, and King's wrenched up at the thought that a man had died marching for his cause. He tells the dead man's 82-year-old grandfather that God will grieve for the youth, and he says God will be the first to cry. And in the end, the old man ends up saying to King, keep up the good work, and the old man who's grieving ends up comforting King to keep up the good work, as I say. It's a very touching scene.
Yeah, absolutely. At the church we see for Jimmy Lee Jackson's funeral, Dr. King gives the eulogy and lays the blame for the death at every policeman who enforces bias laws, every white preacher that defends inequality, and every black person not engaged in the fight for freedom. He refers to the assassinations of both JFK and as we learn very recently, Malcolm X, although we only saw him a couple of scenes ago, he's now been murdered. King energises the crowd and saying that death will not be for nothing. He says he's going back to Washington DC to encourage the president to spend resources not just on a war in Vietnam but on justice in America. And it really is a great, stirring Martin Luther King-esque speech.
But why don't we...
there's quite a lot of reality to cover there.
So let's talk about that very first short Selma march to the courthouse. We said that Oprah's character, Annie Lee Cooper, strikes out at a policeman, and that's actually true. She did lash out and physically hit
the sheriff.
The sheriff himself, that's right.
She smacked the sheriff in the chops and sounded very proud of it.
Yeah, and it just happened slightly later in the action?
It was... basically what the film's done, for quite understandable reasons, is there's a lot of marches in Selma and in surrounding towns that have kind of been conflated into two or three that we'll focus on. So there are some events that we'll cover, some in this check itself, that actually happened in neighbouring towns or at different times. Annie Lee Cooper did smack the sheriff in the face,
and would have gotten arrested.
And he called for help. Yes, she was arrested and dragged off.
And apparently King was not happy at all because she, in that encounter, she struck the first blow. Probably more in self-defence than anything else. But King wasn't happy with that because he's strict, non-violent. We will be the victim and not make anyone else the victim.
Absolutely, and the strength it must take to show that sort of restraint in that face of that sort of provocation is incredible. But George Wallace, who now I just really surprised that he was a Democrat, but of course, as you pointed out, they were called the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats.
Yeah, and remember that back in the Civil War, 100 years earlier, Lincoln was a Republican. And at that moment, as soon as the Civil War ended, well, voting Republican as a white Southerner you would never do. So for more than 100 years, Southern politicians meant Democrats. Right. Including in this era. And in fact, remember that President Johnson, he's from Texas, and he's a Democrat.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's only in the last 20 or 30 years that it's completely inverted now, and the South is solidly Republican. But at this stage, it was quite common to have white racist Democrats, which were a thorn in the side of the Democratic Party when they have the conventions, because they're trying to get the progressive lefts from the North having to, accommodate accommodate the racists from the South.
The conversation reported by between Malcolm X and Corey King was reported by both of them, and it does seem that Malcolm X was actually being quite clever, and he's almost saying, look, Martin Luther King can be the good cop, I'll be the bad cop. As he puts it in his own account of that conversation, he said, if I let the white folks see the alternative to Dr. King, maybe they'll incline more to listen to him. That never came to fruition because he was assassinated very shortly after that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've then got the scene for the
Jimmy Lee Jackson,
the night march.
Yeah. Lakey Stanfield plays Jimmy Lee Jackson in the film. Now this actually happened in Marion, Perry County, and we're going to try and stop this being an enormously monster episode, but I do think some of these it's worth drilling down into a bit. Marion, Perry County, some 27 miles from Selma, there was a very popular pastor, a black pastor called James Orange, who's played in the film by Omar Dorsey. He was part of Dr. King's SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He was arrested on trumped-up charges and dragged to jail. His friends organised by another pastor, another reverend, arranged a night march to jail, planning to pray and sing to him. Now, Al Lingo, who we'll meet again later on, whose sort of self-appointed title was Colonel in charge of state troopers, he arrived in Marion with 20 carloads of state troopers, and they were joined, funnily enough, by Sheriff Jim Clark from Selma, some of his posse men, and a mob of angry whites. And in a chillingly organised attack, and there were news reporters there, contrary to what George Wallace and his advisor think, for the night march in Selma, where that might have been true, but there were news reporters here. As the protesters arrived at the jail, all the streetlights went out, and then the whites immediately attacked the reporters. Cameras were smashed, lighting equipment was smashed. an NBC reporter called Valentino or someone, apparently he's quite well known. He was seen later with a bloodied head. He'd been clubbed. And then as soon as the reporters were dealt with, the troopers, the posse men and the mob piled into the crowd of black protesters. Reverend Debines, who was the organiser of the march, he was beaten, arrested and dragged to jail whilst other deputies still continued to beat him. The marchers split up, desperately tried to retreat to the church, were cut off, and some took refuge in Mac's Cafe, which was a black-owned cafe on a side street. Amongst them were 82-year-old Kager Lee, or Cager Lee, played by Henry G. Sanders, and his grandson, Jimmy Lee Jackson, and Jimmy's mother, Cager's daughter. Troopers followed them in, knocked the lights out, and started beating people indiscriminately. They attacked Cager Lee. Now, this is the old guy we've seen already outside the courthouse in the movie. His daughter tried to protect him. She was beaten to the ground, so Jimmy Lee tried to protect her. One state trooper threw him against a cigarette machine, another shot him twice in the stomach. Then they continued to beat him as he tried to drag himself out into the street. The nearest hospital was in Selma, nearly 30 miles away. They managed to get him there, but the white public hospital wouldn't treat black protesters, so he was taken to the Good Samaritan hospital run by the Catholic mission. Incredibly, as infection sets into his wounds, Al Lingo, this state trooper commander, served an arrest warrant on Jimmy Lee Jackson for assault and battery, and he died 2 days later. In 2007, 42 years after that, former state trooper James Fowler was charged with Jimmy Lee's murder. In 2010, I'm not quite sure why it took 3 years, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 6 months in jail.
So, the night march and it being brutally attacked by police enforcement and some willing volunteers, portrayed in the movie pretty accurately, including storming into a black cafe, including the 3 family members being roughed up, and
But if anything, I think it was even more sinister. It was clearly planned. Knock out the lights. And what the hell's Sheriff Jim Clark doing in Marion?
In a different county altogether.
When he's the sheriff. And a reporter recognised him and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, it was a bit quiet in Selma. It was making me uneasy."
So and it's unofficial capacity.
It's rent-a-mob. Yeah. Absolute rent-a-mob.
The only difference, of course, is that it didn't happen in Selma. The film doesn't expressly say it is in Selma, but you're led to think that from the.
But again, a bit like Hidden Figures compressing 20 years into 9 months. You know, for cinematographic, I can't say that. For narrative reasons,
thank you.
It's. You can understand it. They're not telling any untruths. It's just.
But Cager Lee, his daughter, and Jimmy Lee were all in a cafe. Jimmy Lee gets shot and dies. He dies pretty much in the movie immediately, but in reality, he died a couple of days later.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Dr. King's speech, I kind of winced when he said, "I'm going to lay the death of Jimmy Lee at the feet of black people who don't resist." And he says any black people not engaged in civil rights struggles, and the obvious targets, law enforcement officers who carry out the killing, the white establishment that allows that to happen without any retribution. But he appears to be using a form of the old adage, which is usually attributed to Irish political philosopher Edmund Burke, who says that for evil to triumph, all that is needed is that good men do nothing. So you can so basically saying not restricting discrimination is tantamount to complicity with discrimination. Right.
Back to the film.
I think that's enough of that reality check. Yeah, we'll go back to the film. So
we've had the funeral of Jimmy Lee. We've had
the great
King
MLK speech. Yeah.
Style speech. And so next we see King strategizing his next steps with his entourage. They list off all the petty laws that make it hard for blacks to register, like the need to publish each voter's name and address, as we mentioned already. King is then shown back in the White House advising President Johnson of his plan to march from Selma in Alabama to the Alabama state capital, Montgomery. Johnson is shown as dead against this, and he accuses King of orchestrating everything to lead up to this, including Jimmy Lee's death. An angry Johnson yells at King, and he says he's sick of demands from King, and he insists that King pull his head in for a while.
Yeah, still in the White House, one of Johnson's aides in a side room with some of King's men advises that they've had intelligence that Selma's volatile and racist Sheriff Clark has heard of the proposed Selma to Montgomery march and intends to break it up quickly and almost certainly violently. And they also say, look, Dr. Martin King or any of your important people to your cause should not be in the front line because they're going to be targeted. And then we see President Johnson being a little bit more placatory, and he tries to get MLK to meet him halfway, promising later reforms if he calls off the march now. But Martin Luther King is uncompromising, says no, the march is going to continue. And as he leaves, we see a bitter LBJ ask for his aid to get him J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI.
So he's going to take up Hoover's advice to play dirty by the looks of things, and that's confirmed in the very next scene, where we see the Kings back at home listening to a secret FBI recording of King making love to a woman who's clearly not his wife. King says that it's not him on the tape, but Cora knows that he's been unfaithful, and she seems crushed by this audio confirmation of infidelity. Cora is very weary now. She admits that she's tired of them fighting for equality and the constant fog of death over them and their children. In a touching scene, King says that he loves Cora, and she asks if he loves any of the others. After a long wait, King simply says no, and it seems they may be able to work things out. To smooth things over at home, King hopes to delay the proposed march by a day, so he's on the phone to his advisors, and he says he learns from the advisor that they're very impatient to go. And he says we really need to stay on schedule, and he suggests maybe King can fix his things at home in the next day and join them on day 2. G'day, Linda.
Okay, so a reality check again, and particularly focusing for this one on the relationship between Lyndon B. Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King, and also the involvement of the FBI. Now, some of the portrayals of LBJ in the movie have been criticised. Joseph A. Califano, who was a Lyndon B. Johnson aide at the time, has basically come out and just said it's absolute nonsense.
In the movie?
And the movie, the way it portrays him, it's incredibly biased. Actually, all of this was Lyndon B. Johnson's idea, and he came up with all of this, and he
thought Selma was a great choice and encouraged King to go ahead, but he couldn't publicly support him.
No. And the flip side of that, of course, is we have the movie's portrayal where really he had to be painted into a corner before they were able to get any kind of progress with him. Ava DuVernay has vigorously defended her portrayal of him. However, Andrew Young, who appears in the film, was part of Dr. Martin Luther King's very inner circle, went on to be a UN ambassador and
Mayor of Atlanta.
The Mayor of Atlanta twice. We've actually got an interview clip here with Andrew Young talking firstly about the relationship between Lyndon B. Johnson and Dr. Martin Luther King.
Joined now by Andrew Young, who was an aide to Martin Luther King Jr. He was also the U.S. ambassador to the UN during the Carter administration, as well as a congressman, former mayor of Atlanta. Really appreciate you being here today, sir. Thank you very much for your time. So I want to start with some of the most controversial elements of this movie and just try to establish the basic historical facts here. So we played a clip there, and this is one that's gotten a lot of attention, a December 1964 meeting between Martin Luther King and President Johnson. Martin Luther King making the case for a Voting Rights Act, and President Johnson telling him this thing's just going to have to wait. I believe you were at that meeting. Is that how it played out?
It played out almost that way, but President Johnson did not say that it had to wait. He said that I have a great agenda and I just got through. Remember, this was December, the Civil Rights Act of '64 had just passed in July. So we're coming 6 months afterwards, and we did not expect him to commit. But we did expect him, we were really kind of letting him know that we had to pursue voting rights. His agenda, I found later, was that he thought that the Great Society, Medicare, Title I, aid to the disadvantaged, would be easier for him to bring first. If he had said that, we would have probably agreed with him. But we didn't have a choice, because 3 days after we got back to Atlanta, and this was right after Dr. King won the Nobel Prize, Mrs. Amelia Boynton came over from Selma. And Jim Clark had enjoined the movement against holding an NAACP Emancipation Proclamation service in a church. Jim Clark had said no political meetings can occur in churches. Mrs. Boynton's husband had to be buried from the street because Jim Clark would not let her husband's funeral cortege go into the church. So we were responding to an emergency. We were responding to a crisis. And we agreed that we would go to Selma the 2nd of January. But at the time when we met with President Johnson in the middle of December, neither Dr. King nor President Johnson had thought of Selma.
Okay, so the truth, I think, is closer to what Andrew Young just told us about the relationship between Johnson and King.
And interestingly, he said that for the first meeting they attended, they would have been surprised if he had got there. They thought, well, we know we're going to have to wait for this. So in some respects, they actually made more progress than they thought.
Anyway,
yeah.
People can come to their own conclusions, I guess. So what about that skullduggery by the FBI? Yeah,
they did record him. Now, we were talking about this before we were recording, and I'm sure I read something somewhere that the FBI had recorded him having an affair.
Yeah.
And
sort of
yet something happened to the tape that was corrupted, so they then did get an actor to
two actors
to recreate it, which is why he said that's not me.
Well,
but the events, I mean, he did have extramarital affairs. He was a very charismatic man, travelling all over the US, nearly always without Cora, and that was a decision they'd made, knowing he was a target for assassination. So if there was a successful one, they didn't want their children orphaned. So she basically stayed at home, brought the children up. I think Alex von Tunzelman in The Guardian's Real History column, in her review of the movie, sums it up very nicely when she says, Dr. King emerges as a hero, but not a saint.
Yeah, I think that ends up being a strength in the movie, that they portray him as doubting himself, am I doing the right thing? You know, courage's convictions always come through, but yeah, he's not a saint.
No, and we're now going to play a second clip of the interview with Andrew Young on this business of, did Lyndon B. Johnson, was he involved in the FBI trying to discredit Martin Luther King? And it's quite interesting. If you're a fan of the Kennedys, you might want to cover your ears up.
The other element here that a lot of people around who were around the former president are objecting to is a scene that strongly suggests that LBJ was complicit in what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was doing in terms of surveillance of Martin Luther King and in sending a tape to Coretta Scott King of MLK having some kind of extramarital relation. The scene plays out where the president gets frustrated with Dr. King. He's aware of this surveillance, and then he places a call to J. Edgar Hoover, and then you're shown Coretta Scott King dealing with these revelations. Is that fair to LBJ?
That I don't think is fair to LBJ, because it was actually Robert Kennedy who signed the order allowing the FBI to wiretap all of us. I had a wire running into my house that I just discovered about 2 years ago. And it's probably been there since I moved into that house in 1966. We knew we were bugged, but that was before LBJ. And the FBI director keeps that letter on his desk, and he makes people read it and says that that was one of the lowest positions in the history of the movement of the FBI. Now, even as I say that, one of the things that I like about Selma, and one of the things that the movie shows if we would look at it, is that this was the one time that everybody got everything right. SNCC and SCLC disagreed, but with John Lewis' help, we got it right. We got it together. Johnson actually did a marvelous job, and Nick Cott's book on LBJ and Martin Luther King described the detailed ways in which Lyndon Johnson used his mastery of the political process to deliver this bill. We could not have had this bill without Lyndon Baines Johnson, but Lyndon Baines Johnson could not have passed it without Martin Luther King, without the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson, Viola Liuzzo, James Reeb, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman in Mississippi, Medgar Evers. it's unfair for anybody to talk about credit. Too many people gave their lives. Too many people risked too much.
I think that's a great point. And in terms of the portrayal of the people on the ground who are waging this fight, there have been no objections that have been registered by anybody to this film. It's strictly about that relationship between MLK and LBJ.
Let's even say though that on this occasion, 90 days after President Johnson said he didn't have the power to pass civil rights legislation in 1965. He was standing up on the 28th of March with a joint session of Congress, and he introduced legislation which changed the South. That's what we want to celebrate in the Selma film.
So, yeah, I think Andrew Young, we all know that the FBI at that time were Ed J. Edgar Hoover's private police force in his own view, and he ruled them like Stalin ruled Soviet Russia. But I think Andrew Young, I'm not an expert, but the feeling I get is, LBJ was almost certainly had no idea what the FBI were doing. I don't think many presidents did.
Yeah.
Right then, so back to the movie and the preparations for the first march.
Yeah, and so we've got King likely to miss the first day, according to the last scene. So we cut back to Alabama, and we see Wallace, the black organisers, and all local whites preparing their own reactions to the proposed march. So there's lots of tension in these scenes between all the protagonists, all around within Selma, and also within the black protest movement. We see the Selma protesters drawing straws to determine who will be the unfortunate people at the head of the march, which then promptly and peacefully commences. We see a white reporter watching the march emerge. He's calling in a live account to his newspaper of the march's commencement. Whites look on as the marchers slowly progress across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and down towards the highway on the other end of the bridge. We have some soaring music as the marchers give way and see at the end of the bridge 200 troopers. They're wearing helmets, they're all white of course, and behind that we see a line of police on horseback, including our racist Sheriff Clark. In a touch of gallows humour, one marcher asks the other as they're crossing a bridge, he asks if he can swim. So we see King, who's not present, and all of his supporters tune into the event on live TV. The white police seek to stop the march and turn them around. So pleas from the demonstrators for permission for them to proceed falls on deaf ears. We see the police put on some gas masks and charge at the marchers. Men, women and children are all felled, while 17 million people watch on live TV.
I think in the movie, I think it's 70 million.
Oh, well,
where is it?
I thought I heard that, but I thought back in '65 that might be a bit high. But maybe you're right.
And population of over 200 million, and it's NBC News.
Yeah, it's conceivable.
And I can't remember, is it the President's office or Governor Wallace's office, and someone's like got their head in their hands going, 70 million people are watching this, and realising the effect it's going to have.
Yeah, and so it's clearly a bloody, violent and one-sided affair, and we hear some gunshots, and there's almost certainly going to be some deaths. The reporter on the phone, in the phone booth, he's struggling to keep up with the reports of the mayhem that's going on around him.
And that's a very clever device that the director uses. She's done a really good job there of basically you've got a voiceover, you've got a narrative. In
case you miss something.
Yeah, and giving you the context and what's happening.
We see nightsticks, we hear gunshots, there are horses and even a bullwhip at one stage. Then a couple of tear gas grenades amidst all this chaos. We see Oprah's character fall along the way, she's struck, and then we see the US public, President Johnson and George Wallace are all shown riveted to the violence on their TVs. The marchers are now well and truly on the run, or injured, or on their way to hospital. We have some soaring gospel music closing this scene when some hotheads in the black movement say the black man needs to fight back. Even though they've only got a few guns, we have to use them. Andrew Young, who we've mentioned already, is present. He's one of King's close team members, and he gives the hotheads some advice that they finally accept. He tells them that, what do you think? The white man will kill 10 blacks for every 2 whites that we kill. King has to pick up the pieces. He's now on side, I think, and he immediately says that we're going to try again. In public, in front of the media, King tells them that the war tactics that were just used against US citizens is unacceptable, and he also wants all like-minded people of any colour that can join in his reattempted march. And we see people from across the country getting ready to join him, principally clergy and nuns and the like, in these scenes. But it's all people of all walks and colours of life in this montage scene are coming to join him.
There's a really powerful scene when the news report's on telly, and you mentioned, we see shots of the public, and there's a guy in like a sleeveless jumper, looks like a middle class professional. There's books on the shelves, and him and his wife are handing their evening dinner out to their kids, and they're sitting down for their meal, and they put the TV on, and then they're just staring at these images. It's really quite powerful. You realise that it's difficult today with the internet and everything, but the idea that unless you watched it on the TV news, you didn't know what was happening in the next county, let alone 2,000 miles away in the south of if you lived up in Oregon somewhere. So we can really see people coming alive to what is going on.
Yeah, do we want to comment on how accurate all that mayhem and
I
stuff
think
was?
we probably do. So a bit of a reality check on we call it the First March. Now this became known as Bloody Sunday, one of many sort of such events.
It's the second march in Selma because of the courthouse scene, but it's the first attempt to do the Selma to Montgomery march, which became the iconic march.
It was watched by horrified audiences around the States and internationally. What was being done to US citizens simply trying to register to vote, that most basic of citizen rights, had a huge effect on the momentum of the movement's success, if you look at the larger political landscape. Worth mentioning Jim Clark's posse men. Now, this was a group of about 200 local whites. Originally, they'd been organised after World War II to oppose labour unions. But they just basically become a really menacing tool of white supremacy. Sometimes they were deployed to neighbouring areas or other states. For example, in '62, we earlier mentioned Bull Connor, this brutal police chief in Mississippi, and the posse men had gone to support his white supremacist or racist police force when violence broke out in Oxford, Mississippi in '62, when African-American James Meredith attempted to enrol in the Mississippi University, which was a white-only university.
Just an aside, unrelated to that, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it becomes an important scene from now on for most of the movie. And a bit of research, Edmund Pettus was a Confederate general in the Civil War, and after the Civil War became a Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan.
So you've got a racist bridge.
You've got a racist bridge.
Yeah, man walks around with pillow on head and thinks he's evil. Well, they are evil. They're stupid.
And so the mayhem on the bridge, the gas and the bullwhips and the horses and all that's pretty accurate too, isn't it?
Yeah. The violence was
against unarmed civilians.
Yeah, just incredible. And the marches portrayed are representative of a large number of marches, as we said earlier, organised by various groups, attended by varying numbers in Selma and in neighbouring towns. The results of the marches differed depending on whether they're within the city limits and Police Chief Wilson Baker and his far more humanitarian approach was doing the crowd control, or if it was Clark and the posse men. But there was one occasion that I did read about with students who there was a student protest, and Clark, who was driving beside them in his patrol car, had his deputies and the posse men beat them and encourage them to march faster. And he said, "Do you want to march? I'll let you march." And they used electric cattle prods, batons. They guided them all the way through and out of the town, beating them all the way. And when he got back to the town centre, a smirking Clark told reporters that, unfortunately, the prisoners escaped my custody and walked off laughing. I mean,
he didn't want to arrest them, he wanted to beat them.
Oh, absolute, yeah. We also then have Governor Wallace declares an illegal and unconstitutional ban on all-night marches and assigns 75 state troopers under our lingo to enforce the order. Meanwhile, a former Mississippi Governor, Ross Barnett, told a rally of some 2,000 whites that they face absolute extinction of all we hold dear unless we are victorious. And that's a reality thing, but it also echoes a scene in the movie where Jim Clark, the sheriff, is trying to activate and mobilise some of the his white thugs, and he says to them, we're not having people up in Washington tell us how we can live our lives. We demand the freedom to live our lives in the way we choose. I'm thinking, yeah, but that involves you subjugating other people who are absolutely equal to, according to the American Constitution. So it's incredible that they seem to think they were defending
Entitled.
freedom. No, you're defending your power. Yeah, they don't like sharing, do they, people who have a little bit of power? And I've used that universally, not just at these.
And I think it's true when the film says that immediately King said, no, we're going to have to march again. Like within a day or two, we're going to try again. That's actually what happened. And he did reach out to all like-minded people across the country, and the scenes of people getting ready to join him is correct, I think.
Yeah, but he also wanted to make sure it was legal. So what they did is, and this is the end of the reality which will lead into the next scene, or the end of this reality check, that he did the SCLC national network for the nationwide appeal for all people of conscience. He said, I don't care what religion you are, I don't care what colour you are, just if you believe in what we're doing, come and support us. And to give the expected supporters time to arrive, they planned the march for, I think, the following Tuesday, but they applied for permission from a federal judge.
Yeah.
And so really, I suppose we can now go back to the movie and get the scene where we meet Martin Sheen played Judge Frank Johnson for the first time.
Yeah, suddenly they cut to some new protagonists that we haven't seen, and it's Martin Sheen playing a judge, and you straight away think about his playing Jeb Bartlett in The West Wing, and you wonder what's going on with President Johnson, isn't it? Anyway, we see a black lawyer played by Cuba Gooding Jr. talking to Martin Sheen's character, Alabama Judge Frank Johnson, asking if Johnson will hear a request from King's organisation to overturn George Wallace's governor banning the march. So Martin's already told us that Wallace has jumped up and banned such marches within his own state, and King and his organisation, we learn, have now appealed to overturn this, that it's unconstitutional, from this federal judge.
It's worth pointing out that the federal judicial system had some crimes came out that were seen as a federal crime, and some laws were seen as a federal application. And then each state has, a degree of latitude in creating local laws and trying local crimes, which is why the violence perpetrated by the white supremacists, for want of a better phrase, they knew they could do it with impunity, because if they're done for murder even, it's done as a state crime. They're going to have an all-white, all-male jury, and they just assume that they'll be acquitted immediately, irrespective of the evidence.
So what Cuba Gooding Jr. is trying to get the judge to say, can you investigate their appeal, the King's appeal, pronto, because they want to march in the next day or two. And Martin Sheen's character, the judge, said, no, I'm due to hear him on Thursday, and I'm not going to change my plans. If they want to march, they'll have to wait until after that, otherwise the march will remain illegal.
Yeah, back at the White House, President Johnson's advisor tells him, look, support the proposed march and Selma will become a non-issue. Johnson knows that a successful march will embolden those seeking to change the Jim Crow laws.
He knows Selma would be a big deal, unlike what his advisor says.
Yeah, he also says to an advisor, get George Wallace, the governor, to get him to stop this brutality, and as a quid pro quo, get Martin Luther King to stop the march, don't proceed. But MLK says, no, sorry, we've got to go ahead. And of course, all these people have arrived from all over the country.
Yeah, mainly clergy.
So I guess they've got to do it. Hundreds of clergy now arrived from across the country to support the march. They couldn't remain quiet after Martin Luther King reached out. And we see a number of people saying goodbye to their wives and their families and packing a suitcase and heading on down to join. So we go back to the infamous bridge.
The next day.
And the marchers, it's a huge number of them. They're now taking over the whole bridge.
One lane, but they're half of the bridge,
Yeah. Not just the
first
sidewalk.
bridge, they were so small in number that they left. Yeah, exactly. Left the sidewalk. Now they're spilling onto the main lanes of the bridge.
Hundreds of black and white clergy lead the march. There's rabbis there. There's looks like Greek Orthodox priests with the big square beards.
Nuns.
And they're faced by dozens of helmeted police at the other end of the bridge. After a moment's pause with a kind of, oh my goodness, on the face of the demonstrators, Colonel Al Lingo gets his little bullhorn loudspeaker and says, troopers, withdraw.
So they've seemingly had a victory. The troopers, the menacing troopers have stood down, threatening
cleared
the marches.
road. But to our surprise, I suppose, Martin Luther King and the marchers all kneel in prayer. Then we see him stand up, turn around, and march back.
Calling off the march.
And there's a lot of confusion on the face of the marchers, sort of like, okay, why are we turning around? What are we doing?
We've just had a win.
And then we see the argument, people saying we had the opportunity, we could have, continued. And he says, as soon as we cross the state line, the city boundary at the end of that bridge, we're in violation of the federal judge, and he will not support us if we continue. Also, how do you know that wasn't a trap? Yeah, let's get them away from all the TV cameras, get them out on the countryside.
5 miles down the road.
Then there's an ambush, he said, and someone says there were people who are angry, and he said, what was it? He said, I'd rather people were angry and hated me than were beaten up or dead.
Yep.
So, he's on his own back in Selma. Martin Luther King writes a touching letter to Cora, and we hear his voice as he writes it on how her sacrifice and support means so much to him. He acknowledges the fog of death that she mentioned earlier, and he needs her faith for him to continue. And then we see
back in Selma.
It's back in Selma. It's night time.
The march has been disbanded. Everyone's trying to process exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
And we see a white preacher and a reporter doing exactly that, trying to figure out what's going on and whether they need to stay for the march or will there be another one. Whatever, and while they're having this discussion on the street, some angry white racists set upon the pro-black demonstrators, give them a beating, and then we see King being informed that as a result of the beatings, it ended in the death of one
Reverend Reeb,
white pastor that we'd seen leaving his
from
wife
the
in
Unitarian Church.
In Boston, I think.
Yeah, and he's a bespectacled, very sincere. He looks like a vicar, doesn't he?
Yeah. So maybe we could do a reality check at that point.
Yeah, probably.
The important successful second march over the bridge. How accurate is it that they all stopped, that there was a bit of a prayer, and that Martin Luther King called it off? That is all correct, isn't it?
Absolutely. And they did go to Frank Johnson, Judge Johnson, a federal judge. He did say, I will examine this, but it's going to take time, and if you march tomorrow, it's illegal. But he points out to them in the history I read, and I really ought to give a reference to my source. There's a number of articles that we've read, but also the book I read by Frank Hartford, called Selma. It was very good, very well researched. But he says that it was Frank Johnson said, the judge, look, you can march within Selma City. It's only going out into the county that it's been banned. So, and the city limit was the far side of the bridge. So on the bridge, they're legal. And the point that Martin Luther King keeps making to his close advisors is if we break the law, we need support from a lot of powerful people, politicians and, leaders of industry and all that sort of thing in the media. We can't allow our opponents to have an opportunity to say, look, they defy the law, they think they're above the law, they're insurrectionists.
You've already mentioned that it was really important for King to not break federal laws.
And he never had.
And the racist local state laws was exactly what they were trying to overturn the hypocrisy of, so breaking them is acceptable to him, but he wants the feds on his side. He doesn't want...
Now, what we do know is Lyndon Johnson, from the film, had been sort of asking for a delay. You could do your march, but not quite yet. Give me time. And they don't really explain at that stage why he wants the time. Now, in reality, there are some suggestions that Federal Judge Johnson was in contact with President Johnson, who said, delay them, because the hearing dragged on and on and on. After the march where they turned back, when you had 1,000 people had arrived, 40 ministers, rabbis, nuns, priests. Reverend James Reed, played in the movie by Jeremy Strong, was indeed... It was actually him and 2 other Unitarian ministers, and they said the area they went to
was a black area. And
black area,
and the meal was in
the
black
cafe.
Walking
back, they passed the Silverman Cafe, which was basically a Klansman's hideout or cafe bar, and black people would have known at night you don't walk past there. But not being local, they didn't know. There'd been a lot of advice given to the people coming down, but in the heat of the moment, they walked past, and Reed was beaten and
as the movie
suffered
shows.
a brain hemorrhage, and had to be taken to a hospital to Birmingham, 90 miles away, who said we're not treating him until we have a $150 deposit. So they had to have a whip round. That was a lot of money in those days. But he did die. It's the whole process of the power of Martin Luther King's, or the strength of his leadership, not responding violently, but then turning everyone around. And the interesting thing is, even though they're all having a go at him afterwards, and apparently there was a lot of, all these people have come down here, and there's a wonderful bit in the book I read where someone says, and it's a memory by a teenage girl who was there, a black girl, and her parents, Bruce Hartford's book, and someone said, I know why we didn't get attacked by the troopers today. Police don't attack white folk. And he's answered, this guy who was quite angry, he's answered by a woman saying, yeah, you're right. They didn't beat us today because the world's with us, but that's what we want. And don't let these white people feel we don't appreciate them coming. So, you can understand the resentment. And also, I think it is worth mentioning that when James Reeb died, his widow had received a telephone call from President Johnson. He laid on an Air Force jet to
get the body home,
to take her and her husband's body back to Boston, I think they were from. Jimmy Lee Jackson's mum, 2 lines in the local paper. No one, no politicians called her. So you can really understand this feeling of
second-class citizens.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And again, as we've mentioned before, Andrew and I are both white, middle-class males. We've never experienced this sort of discrimination based purely on something over which you have no control. But this generated even more attention and even more marches breaking out. So this is not happening in Selma in isolation. This is happening right across the south.
Yeah, and the north as well. All across America. Even in Canada, there were sympathetic demonstrations.
Oh, and there was the first and so far only student sit-in in the White House.
Yeah,
a dozen students posing as tourists managed to get inside, and then both black and white, and they did a sit-in.
Which neatly takes us back to the movie, because in the very next scene, we see Johnson on the phone to King, telling him that his demonstrators have just held the first and only demonstration of the White House, as Martin says, and Johnson is fuming, and he tells King that he needs to stop his people from doing this, or else. We don't know what the else is, but King won't be beaten, and he says any demonstrators' deaths are on the president's hands until he passes the Voting Rights Act. King tells off Johnson, and he says violence and death are occurring, and Johnson won't even show his face in Alabama. So he's really pushing the president to do something, despite the president wanting King to do something. Then we see King back in Selma in a car going for a ride with one of the young, hot-headed, impatient organisers.
Well, this is John Lewis. He's actually the voice of reason amongst the SNCC, isn't he?
Yeah, he is. He's the one
more
that
reasonable
tends to
guy.
prevail, and King's trying to, keep him on board. He tells him that LBJ is not moving, and he wants to cancel the march while people feel so threatened, and he clearly needs the approval of the local blacks that are so desperate for change. The young organiser, tells King of his experiences as the local trying to organise things and defending himself from violence of the earlier local demonstrations while he saw his friends were being beaten in front of him. Despite his injuries, he patches himself up and drags himself to church to hear King speak. So the next day, we cut to an Alabama courthouse. We see King is reunited with Cora, who's come to join him. In the courthouse of the Martin Sheen character, Judge Johnson, King is seeking, as we said, to get approval for a new march and overturn Governor Wallace's ban on the marching. King is accused of ignoring judges and governors' orders by proceeding in the second Selma march. So the prosecution, the state side, is saying that King's just ignoring government orders. The white attorney for Alabama overplays his hand, and the judge, hearing testimony from many victims in a montage sequence from the first bloody march on the bridge, and Judge Johnson then gives a ruling that comes down on King's side. The 5-day march from Selma to Montgomery is approved by this federal judge. So we see some energised marchers preparing for the new, now official march, and the gossip amongst the demonstrators is that they've got some Hollywood stars and high-profile folk singers are coming to join them as well.
I think Nina Simone gets mentioned at one time.
And Joan Baez, she's mentioned.
We see the governor and the president. Governor Wallace has been summoned to the Oval Office, and Wallace says he wants a federal override of the court ruling, but Johnson is out. It's like absolutely no chance. He won't have it. He says, George, you've always been a champion of the poor. Why are you so against this, this black movement? And Wallace says, it's the thin end of the wedge. Soon they'll be asking for all sorts of things.
Welfare and everything.
Yeah, like, duh. And Johnson invites Wallace to roll over and he says, just let them vote. And he uses a very, very defamatory word, which...
The N-word.
Maybe it's the sign of the times. I'm not sure if Lyndon Johnson would have been stupid enough to use that word. Or maybe he's playing to his audience.
Maybe.
But Wallace won't be moved. But then Johnson really turns to him and says, I'll be damned if I let history put me in the same place as you. That's right, because he says to him, how do you want to be remembered? Do you want to be remembered as the man who said no? And Wallace says, I don't really care about how history views me. And Johnson clearly does. He says, I'm damned if I'll let history put me in the same place as you. And then we see President Johnson addressing the US Congress, saying what happened at Selma was a disgrace. The issue of equal rights for blacks can no longer be ignored. He said this is not, and the word he uses is Negro, because obviously they're trying to use accurate language at the time, so I apologise if that offends anybody, but he said there's not a Negro problem, it's not a white problem, it's an American problem. He refers to the constitutional right to vote, and he says, I'm sending a bill to Congress to abolish these Jim Crow laws. He ends with the phrase, we shall overcome. King is seen at home Martin Luther King is seen at home with his wife Cora, relieved at the news. Interesting that he uses the phrase "we shall overcome,"
it's a catchphrase,
which was the civil rights theme song, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
So he's come down, quickly turned around and come down on the side of the demonstrators.
Yeah.
He's had that road to Damascus conversion.
And I think it's worth just wrapping that up, and because I know I don't want to take issue with the road to Damascus. I don't think he's been turned around.
No,
I think he was always on that road. He's just had to change up a few gears and accelerate. So all over the southern, in reality, this is kind of got the timeline right. But remember, we mentioned that federal Judge Johnson was dragging out the court hearing. It went over about 5 or 6 days. On the 5th day, with no end in sight, they hear that President Johnson has announced his bill to Congress. Suddenly the next day, Frank Johnson, the federal judge, goes, yeah, it's fine, it's approved, you can go.
Yeah, maybe not a coincidence.
So maybe he was creating the delay, knowing that Martin Luther King would obey the federal ruling. So it must have been really frustrating. But the decision by President Johnson to push this bill forward, when in reality he announced it to Congress, every single senator and representative from Virginia, Mississippi boycotted it, didn't attend. Many more from the southern states didn't attend, but it went through. But using the "We shall overcome" tagline absolutely astonished people by all accounts.
Just going back a little bit, we said the fact that the Reverend Reeb from Boston really did get killed by some hot-headed racists.
Yeah.
Did you want to just mention what happened as a result of that in reality? Who was held accountable for that?
Yeah. Well, again, we see the difference between Sheriff Clark and Police Chief Wilson Baker, because Baker arrested 4 men for the murder of Reverend Reeb. One of them turned state's evidence, went to court.
He ratted the others out.
Yeah. The other 3, Elmer Cook, William Hoggle and Naaman Hoggle, were all charged with murder and virtually immediately acquitted by an all-white jury in Selma, because to sit on a jury, you have to be a registered voter.
Yeah.
So
no sanction for the death of this white
no
pastor.
sanction at all, but at least Police Chief Baker had tried to arrest somebody for it, and I suppose, it's baby steps, but that might be seen by some by progress.
So back to the film?
Back to the film, and we have the security service, a security service guy saying to Martin Luther King, look, we can't guarantee protection on every stretch of your 5-day march. And you have to understand you are a real target. And MLK's like, yeah, look, I'd like to live a long time, but I'll be for the people who fought and gone before me, if I can make this march from start to end, I'll be happy. And it's thousands, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolute thousands. And they show actual footage of the march.
In the movie and in reality, they're over both lanes of the bridge from side to side now is marching in one direction.
And they're guarded by the US Army.
And I think Alabama State Troopers on the direction of...
Alabama National Guard were called out, put under direct command. Now, this is in reality, so this is going to be a little bit of reality. They were placed under direct command of the Pentagon, and of course the National Guard were all white, because you had to be a registered voter to be in the National Guard. So they're all white, and apparently very resentful, but all the close protection was done by US Army, who might have been recruited from anywhere over the country. They were white, they were black. They had a couple of helicopters. We see people like Sammy Davis Jr.
In the real footage from the era interspersed into the movie, the black and white
Harry
footage.
Belafonte.
The marches is extremely well organised. They've got food stops. They've got places to sleep. It was a great success. We can feel already.
Yeah, and I mean, in reality, 25,000 people on arrival. I think about 12,000 made the 5-day march, and then but they were met by more at Montgomery, and there's about 25,000. So, that's in a small rural Alabama town. That's a huge impact. And of course, they had TV coverage. And then at the end of the march, we see Martin Luther King give an incredibly stirring speech at the foot of the state capitol building. And during his speech, the film sort of wraps up the future fate of some of the main players.
So they focus in on an image of one particular protagonist in the movie, and they tell us what happened. And the first one that they focus on is the 83-year-old Cager Lee, the dead Jimmy Lee's grandfather, who we learned from the closing scenes got to vote for the first time in his life at the age of 83 as a result of the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah, Andrew Young, who we heard from the clips from the interview with the real Andrew Young, and is also portrayed in the movie. He becomes appointed US Ambassador to the UN and then won the Atlanta mayoral race twice.
We see John Lewis, who we've mentioned, another organiser who ends up getting elected to federal Congress for a 27-year term.
Yeah. Governor George Wallace, played by Tim Roth. Again, Tim Roth, he's a bit like John Malkovich. He's very good at playing creepy, evil characters. Unsuccessfully ran for president 4 times as a Democratic nomination before an attempted assassination put him in a wheelchair. It was not, as it turns out, a political assassination. It was just an absolute nut job. A white guy. He wanted to kill Nixon, couldn't get close enough to him, so he went for Wallace.
The next update we get on the screen is the evil sheriff John Clark, and we learn that he lost his position.
Jim Clark,
thank you.
Yeah.
He lost his position in the next election due to a strong black voter turnout.
Which sort of shows the importance of being able to have the population all vote. We then see a tall white lady, and her name was Viola Liuzzo. She was a white marcher with Martin Luther King's group. And the caption says she was murdered by the KKK 5 hours after King's speech as she drove a black marcher back to Selma. Now, I think this is one of those times where it's worth just going into that, but we'll finish off what the movie shows first.
Then the next shot we see is of Cora Scott King, his wife. We learn that she never remarries, but keeps up the good fight and successfully lobbies to get Martin Luther King's birthday as a national holiday.
Yeah, President Johnson goes on to sign the Voting Rights Act in 1965 with Martin Luther King by his side, and Martin Luther King himself.
We learn in the final update at the end of the film that after 13 years of leading the non-violent protest movement for black rights, he's murdered a few years later in 1968 at the age of 39.
Yeah, the movie credits roll with a montage of still images from the film, and there's a song, Glory, by John Legend and Common. And Common actually appears in the film, doesn't he, as one of the black organisers.
And I think this is the song that won the Oscar for the best song for the year.
Yeah, and the gospel tunes interspersed with a modern rap song, which is Fink's Yesterday Was Hard on All of Us, with references to Ferguson, more modern racial events. So I think the Viola Liuzzo incident. I mean, they say a white racist will hate black people, but they'll hate white supporters of black people even more because they feel they've been betrayed.
And so, of course, that summary of what happened to her, this minor player in the movie, is actually correct, and she was killed a few hours after this.
I mean, she had a car there. She
wasn't from Selma. She was from somewhere up north, but she was driving some black protesters back to their homes in Selma.
Well, yes, she'd. I think she'd already done one shuttle run,
right?
And she had a young black protester called I've got his name here somewhere, Leroy Moton or Motton. 19-year-old, tall, lanky lad. He'd done the march as well, and so she said, "Look, I'll take you back." Now, the Ku Klux Klan had organised action teams, and one of these action teams had been trying all day to get close enough to kill Martin Luther King, but unable because of the army presence. These were William Eaton, Eugene Thomas, Collie Wilkins, and Gary Rowe, all experienced Klan members. Elmer Cook, one of the guys who murdered the Reverend Reeb, came up to their table at the cafe where they were trying to work out what to do next and said, "I did my job, now you go do yours." So they drive out looking for a target, and they see Mrs. Liuzzo, a white woman with a black passenger.
Male passenger at that.
Black male passenger. So they follow them till they clear the army patrols, pull alongside. With Eugene Thomas driving, the other three all open fire. Viola was killed instantly, hit in the head, but Leroy Moton, the passenger, he managed to steer the slowing car to a halt. He was uninjured but covered in her blood, and the Klansmen returned, but he feigned death, and they leave thinking they've killed them both. Incredibly, Gary Rowe was an active FBI informant who'd been asked for and been granted permission to join the KKK action team by his FBI handlers.
So one of the guys, one of the four was an FBI undercover agent.
Yes, and he definitely pulled the trigger, along with the other two. And despite J. Edgar Hoover's assertion when it came out to the president that he didn't fire his weapon, he wasn't actively involved other than a passenger and a witness, that was later refuted. He'd been on the FBI books for 5 years. He was also believed to have been involved in the bombing in Birmingham, Alabama, that killed the 4 little girls that we saw earlier. It's kind of slightly mind-blowing, and I seem to have lost a page of my notes.
But if you had that in a movie, a fictional movie, you would say, no, that can't be true, but it's not mentioned in this movie, and it actually is true.
No. Gary Rowe, predictably, turned state's evidence, and because they were all quickly identified and arrested in charge of murder. Rowe saw his charges dropped for agreeing to testify, but as murder is a state crime, Alabama released all 3 on bail. Leroy Moton was taken north, so the Klan can't kill the only eyewitness before the trial. But when it started, again, a sort of small amount of progress. It's an all-male, all-white Alabama jury, but after a 2-day deliberation, they came back and said, we're deadlocked at 10-2 in favour of convicting on manslaughter. I mean, how you convict someone for manslaughter when they pointed a pistol at someone's head and pulled the trigger? I have no idea, but they did, rather than first-degree murder. So a mistrial's called, but it's still seen progress. At the retrial...
the jury acquits, but the 3 killers end up being tried by Judge Johnson.
The Martin Sheen character, the federal judge.
On a federal charge of violating Viola Liuzzo's civil rights, and is sentenced to the maximum possible for that crime, and it's 10 years in jail. Gary Rowe is paid a $10,000 bonus by the FBI and disappears into witness protection. Yeah,
never to be heard from again. But hopefully he died of some painful form of cancer or something, I don't know. I just find it staggering, absolutely staggering. This was, because as we were saying earlier, the demarcation between federal offences and local and state offences, this was the only way that you could get these, KKK murderers, you had to charge them with the infringement of civil rights. And this happened on a number of occasions. It happened in Mississippi around this time, where they charge them, and so there was a limit to, you couldn't send them away for 30 years, you couldn't put them in an electric chair, but you could at least get them in jail for a period of time. If they were tried by their local peers,
don't get off.
Invariably they will be cleared. So, conclusions. I mean,
a great film.
Brilliant film, absolutely brilliant, brilliant. Moving,
Very
and again, like Hidden Figures, it's not preachy. It doesn't overly play on too blatantly trying to pluck your heartstrings. It just, and nothing they show isn't true. Again, just for the purposes of encapsulating it within a single film. You know, it's maybe the locations moved or timelines are slightly muddled, not muddled, but edited.
So what do you? I'd like to give it a 9. I think.
Oh yeah, 9 out of 10 for entertainment. And for history, really, I think
not very different.
I'm tempted to say 8 because I think there is. I wonder if Anna DuVernay has reacted to what would see themselves as the progressive white establishment trying to claim that, take the credit away from Martin Luther King and give it to Lyndon B. Johnson. Maybe her reaction to that. And she said, it's offensive to suggest it was LBJ's ideas, and that's an offence to all the people who worked so hard. And as someone in the film says, he's sat in Washington. He's not getting his head caved in. He's sat in an office protected by the Secret Service. We're the ones on the front line. And it's absolutely true.
We have said before with our podcast that when there's a villain, all the films seem to need a villain, and they pick a historical movie. They'll make somebody a touch more villainous than they really were in real life. I feel like from The Bounty. And
was it you telling me there's someone who wanted to make a historically based film and pitched their idea to some Hollywood producers, and their first question was, right, who's the bad guy?
Yeah.
Who's the villain?
And so
there's got to be a villain.
I think the director, if our research is correct, has overplayed her hand on making Johnson a little bit more villainous than he was in real life. He was way sympathetic.
He's a politician, so obviously he tells lies. You can tell that because his lips are moving. But and we know he told the big one about Vietnam, and he has a line in the film where he says to Martin Luther King, you have one issue, I have 101, and that's true. He's a politician, and I think both of them were aware of the need to get a surge of public opinion behind them, and that will carry them over the line, in the way that Martin Luther King was very aware of using his celebrity to get national TV. Sometimes you think, what's that celebrity getting themselves on telly for doing that? And actually, if you're being pragmatic, it raises the profile and it gets attention to issues that might not otherwise do so.
Yeah, the black actress in Star Trek at the time, Michelle Nichols, I think, Lieutenant Uhura.
Yeah.
There's a story that she tells that after the first season, she couldn't see a future in Star Trek and was going to not renew either the second or third season, and she was going to bail. And she herself tells a story that she was at a dinner party and somebody said, there's somebody you really want to meet. And turns out it was Martin Luther King, and he said to her, you need to understand what a great job you're doing as a role model. We need more black people. Yeah. So he knew the value of the media, and and talked her in, and she stayed, and was typecast forever as Lieutenant Uhuru.
And of course, I was born 7 months after these events, and although I'm not named for Martin Luther King, my parents, my dad would have gone on that march if we'd lived in America, no doubt. And when a policeman beat his face in, he'd have tried to calmly explain why violence was, was non-progressive and counterproductive, as his other side of his face got bashed in. But certainly when they were looking for names, they said they felt very positive towards the name Martin because of Martin Luther King. So
that's nice.
Yeah, I feel a bit of connection. I don't know.
So the history. What are we going to mark them down for the Johnson
kind of lower
thing?
than 8.
No.
I think 8's reasonable because factually they're bang on.
And the sequence of events, and it is factually very good. It's just that one villainous Johnson portrayal maybe that we take a couple of points off. I think 8's good for history as well.
And I think Anna DuVernay's she's done a fantastic job. Her and Paul Webb between them is writing these speeches to sound like Martin Luther King, to have exactly the same message, but
not be his
for legal
words.
reasons, copyright reasons, having to change the actual words. And the portrayal by David Oyelowo was mesmerising.
Yeah,
and he's got the voice. He's got the economy of movement. When you watch Martin Luther King, he's not a wave the arms around kind of guy. He's very controlled and measured, and really, really well done. Just slightly disappointed that John Malkovich didn't play Governor Wallace.
Oh, that would have been cool.
Nothing against Tim Roth. So,
all right.
But I suppose also in the wider conclusion, the you know, how much difference did it make? And tragically, we still see, you know, black people being shot by white policemen, particularly in the southern states. With, you know, and there was one a few years ago, a 13-year-old kid riding away from the policeman on a bicycle, clearly unarmed, or absolutely no evidence that he had any kind of weapon, and he's shot in the back and killed, and the policeman was suspended for 2 days as they investigated and said, no, carry on.
All clear.
And, you know, I mean, as a British soldier, you weren't allowed to do that. When someone's no longer a threat to you, you cannot shoot them. I find it incredible. On the positive side, we've had a black president. You know, we've had you know, black leaders of industry. Colin Powell was the most senior officer in the American Army. So, of course, progress has been made, but it needs to continue to be made. And, you know, I think films like this can maybe raise awareness of where we come from and the power of working together for what we're trying to achieve, even if that's only for one part of the community, and also for parts of the community going, actually, we've got a lot, they haven't got much. Maybe we just need to say we need to give some of what we've got to them.
Oh, fingers crossed.
Yeah, it's never happened yet in human history, but there's always hope it might start. And on that cynical note,
let's wrap it up, eh?
Yeah, and look forward. Next time we'll be back for a politically uncomplicated look at space with Apollo 13. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.